Mr. Speaker, I came today and wanted to share with you a story about my district, and more specifically, a portion of my district in Zion, Illinois. Mr. Speaker, Zion has 25,000 residents and sits on the shores of Lake Michigan. And yet, due to the obstruction of the administration, tons of spent nuclear fuel remain stored at Zion. It's stored on the shores of the Great Lakes, literally just a few hundred feet away from the shore, where 30 million Americans receive their fresh drinking water. We need to make sure we can do everything we can to protect what I believe is the jewel of our ecosystem in the Great Lakes. But so long as the fuel remains there, the city of Zion cannot use this site to bring new businesses or new jobs on that site, suffer from lost revenue from lost property taxes. The uranium that has been used in the nuclear reactor stays radioactive, Mr. Speaker, for tens of thousands of years. It stays radioactive after it has been removed from the reactor, and it must be isolated from the environment in order to allow it to safely degrade. Unfortunately, the federal government has not done its part to take charge. As we talked about earlier, Mr. Speaker, the federal government's the one that actually owns the fuel. And so it is sitting now in our communities as opposed to going to a site where we've spent nearly $15 billion researching and putting money into at Yucca Mountain. For the past 3 decades, the policy of the federal government has been to push forward with a long-term, deep geologic repository at Yucca Mountain in Nevada. 13 years ago, the Department of Energy determined that Yucca Mountain was the best and safest location to store America's nuclear waste. Indeed, it is the law of the land, as we have heard tonight. And we spent billions of dollars to study the site and get it ready to be able to store our spent nuclear fuel. Mr. Speaker, despite the billions of dollars spent, nothing's been done on Yucca Mountain since this administration has taken office. The administration cut off funding for Yucca Mountain and ensured that nothing would be done to get this site ready. This despite the 3 decades spent studying the site and over $15 billion spent. If we do not proceed, that money will be completely wasted. Further, the administration has failed to bring forward any kind of alternative, meaning that spent nuclear waste continues to sit in our communities where I would argue it should not be. America's nuclear power plants have produced over 71,000 metric tons of spent nuclear fuel over the past 6 decades. And while it is jobs and clean energy, we do have an obligation to make sure that it is stored and stored safely. We need to make sure that it is stored in a long-term facility. But instead, spent nuclear fuel remains at plants at least 75 nationwide sites, including Zion. Mr. Speaker, there is a solution to this problem, which affects not only Zion, but the entire country. We can fund the Yucca Mountain project and ensure that we will solve the problem once and for all. If we don't, the only alternative right now is to leave the waste where it is, stored in places like Zion, leaving both Zion and the drinking water for 30 million Americans vulnerable to an environmental disaster or a terrorist event, leaving the residents of Zion with a large plot of land in the heart of their community that, frankly, we can't use. Mr. Speaker, the only responsible course of action is to tackle this problem today. We've seen the statistics out there, and frankly, as we look at what the facts are, the Department of Energy has determined that the deep geological disposal is the safest method to store spent nuclear fuel. If we just look at the difference here, Zion, Illinois, on the shores of Lake Michigan, there are 65 casks containing 1,135 metric tons of nuclear waste. Waste stored above the ground, about 5 feet above the water table and just a few hundred feet away from the shores of Lake Michigan. And yet Yucca Mountain, on the other hand, a place where we've spent $15 billion, where our experts have said is the safest place for us. It's where we actually tested a nuclear weapon. It's near an Air Force base. So when people talk about the neighbors, as Congressman Shimkus talked about earlier, the neighbors are the federal government. The federal government owns the spent. The federal government owns the land around it. The federal government owns the site at Yucca Mountain. Yucca Mountain, again, 100 miles away from the Colorado River. The storage that we're talking about would be 1,000 feet above the water table because it's important that we protect our water. 1,000 feet below ground. This is the ideal spot, and yet we've come not on science. This hasn't been objected to by the scientific research. This has been objected to for political reasons. And frankly, I have to tell you, Mr. Speaker, the politics has to end. Because what it's doing is it's jeopardizing communities across our nation. We should be transporting this spent nuclear fuel to the safest location possible to make sure that we are not putting our citizens at risk, that we're not damaging or potentially damaging the environment. The Department of Energy has concluded that the repository would have little or no adverse impact on future populations or the environment. These are key. So we are going to take a look at what the Department of Energy has to say and the studies that have been done. And this is literally, Yucca Mountain is probably the most studied piece of real estate that we have in our nation today. All the studies that have come back, they say this is the spot that we should be storing this spent nuclear fuel. And instead, it is staying all across the country at the cost to the taxpayers. The federal government owns the nuclear fuel. And when it refused, according to the law, to take that nuclear fuel back and deal with it, we had our companies out there that basically said, well, what are we supposed to do with it? And so they sued on breach of contract, literally costing taxpayers billions of dollars. We heard my colleague from Washington talk that it could be as much as $50 billion that the federal government, the hardworking taxpayers, are going to pay to keep the fuel, the spent nuclear fuel, where we don't want it to stay. The government has an obligation, Mr. Speaker, to step up and do the right thing. I, for one, am delighted to be able to be here today to tell you about the story of Zion, Illinois, but we recognize that this is a situation that's impacting over 104 different sites. We cannot afford to wait any longer. There are some on the other side of the building, Mr. Speaker, that are specifically holding this process up. We need to move forward. We need to make sure Yucca Mountain is approved, open, and again, being able to store this for up to 1 million years. It's the right thing to do. And I urge my colleagues, Republicans and Democrats, right? We've got those in the Illinois delegation to my south, rely on Lake Michigan. This is something that we should all be united behind. So I'm honored to be able to come up and talk about this, but I'm also saddened that it's taken so long and that if we do nothing, it will be potentially decades longer. This is unacceptable. The citizens of our country demand that the United States government abide by the law and by its obligations to store the spent fuel at Yucca Mountain. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.